Howdy. Welcome to 5 Minutes with KeRusso. I'm speaking to you kind of weird with a Western twang because I'm in Oklahoma right now. And when you're in Oklahoma, you do as Oklahomans do, right? Well, we're not going to make fun of them too much. I like that. I grew up in Texas, so I know this Western twang. I want to talk to you about cancel culture today. The idea about this cancel culture, something none of us heard of a year ago. But the basic premise is this: is people are sensitized, and if they're offended by somebody, they call them out publicly. They shame them, and they're expecting some kind of appropriate response, or they in some way will get canceled. Pressure will be put on them to be fired, lose their status, or for some negative consequence to take place. And people are being called out, people are being canceled for things they have done recently, for things they did a long time ago. And people who are calling out others, are giving in to that. Sometimes they're finding out a little bit later that they're on the receiving end of it. Somebody's been offended by something they said or something they did, and they're under threat of being canceled. And it becomes this ever-increasing cycle of canceling one another out and being afraid of what somebody is going to think about you for whatever reason, because you don't want to offend the wrong people, or they will put pressure to get you canceled. Now, let me just say this. There are people who do some pretty offensive things that need to be called out in probably a better way, but they need to be held accountable. But how do you live in the middle of this cancel culture? Well, I want to share with you something from Jesus, because Jesus lived in a cancel culture himself. And I want to share with you an event that took place. It's recorded in the last verse of John chapter 7 and the first verses of John chapter 8. The power players of Jesus' culture were some religious leaders, and they grabbed this woman. They didn't really care about her. They're just using her. And maybe that's part of what goes on in the cancel culture. You don't really care about what somebody's done or not done. You just use them for your purposes. Well, that's definitely what was being done here. They grabbed this woman who was caught in the very act of adultery. Now, in our particular culture today, that wouldn't cause anybody to bat an eyelash, or most people wouldn't, but it's a pretty serious deal in Jesus' culture. And they literally wanted to cancel this woman. They wanted to kill her, stone her. And they brought her out before Jesus, and they publicly called her out, publicly shamed her, and they wanted Jesus to cast the verdict that's going to get her stoned, get her canceled. Well, how does Jesus respond to that? There are two things I want to share with you that Jesus did that I think are important for us and can help us. First is what he said to the people, to those power players, and to the crowds that kind of got into this and wanted to stone the woman themselves and cancel her. Jesus said to them in verse 7, he says, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." He brought humility into this scenario, and he made people realize that every single one of them were candidates for cancellation if they really wanted to push it. And nobody was in a place to point fingers at this woman and can't call for her cancellation. Well, that humility carried the moment, and all those people walked away because they realized that they had their own things to be ashamed of. The second thing I would share with you is what Jesus said to the woman, because what she did was wrong. Now, we may not, or many people in our culture may not realize that it was wrong, think it's wrong, but it was, and it still is, because it's not holy to be involved with adultery, engaged in adultery. Jesus says to the woman, if you read this in the last verse, verse 11, he says, "Go now and leave your life of sin." She didn't get a free pass. Jesus didn't pat her on the back and say, you never should have been called out. Basically what he says, I showed you grace. Now go live into that grace and live differently. All of us could be called out for things that we are ashamed of and should be ashamed of. And some of us might still be, maybe all of us still might be engaged in those things. And Jesus, what would he say to us? He wouldn't call for our cancellation. He's trying to redeem us. But he would hold us accountable. And he would tell us to change. So remember the humility and remember the call to change. It can help us as we're living in the middle of another cancel culture. Well, partners, thanks for spending time with me, and we'll see you next time on 5 Minutes with KeRusso. Be blessed.